Yet another thing that researchers have to keep in mind is priming. I don't know if you remember priming from your intro psych class. It's when one thing sort of activates certain concepts in your mind and you respond to those concepts. Um, and that can happen um, if you order your questions in a certain way. For instance, the question, how frequently do your children play, right, can be interpreted differently depending on what the previous question was. If the previous question is about your children's interested, if it is about your children playing musical instruments, then how frequently do your children play could be interpreted as playing musical instruments. If the previous question was about sports, then perhaps the question about how frequently do your children play can be interpreted in terms of sports, right? So the question order here can have a really important effect. But it goes further than simply your interpretation of a question. One example listed in the textbook comes from a questionnaire by a guy called Wilson and colleagues in 2008. Half of the participants were asked the following couple of questions in this order. Do you generally favor or oppose affirmative action programs for women? Followed by, do you generally favor or oppose affirmative action for racial minorities? The other half of the participants were first asked about racial minorities, then asked about women. So, same two questions. What they found was that a greater proportion of white people tended to support affirmative action for minorities if it was asked as the second question. So if they first were asked about women and then asked about racial minorities, a greater proportion of white people agreed with it than if they were asked about women first. Now, you can interpret that in various ways. White people tend to support affirmative action for women more than for racial minorities. And one way in which you can interpret that is that when they first respond to the statement about women, they want to be consistent, right? After all, we do have a drive for consistency, right? So um, point being is that the question order matters. Now, how do we know which is the correct one? Well, we don't really. One way to control for order effects is to have different versions of a survey with the questions in different sequences, and then report the results separately for the different orders. But yeah, so these issues and other issues, the phrasing of questions, the ordering of question, make the creation of a questionnaire or a poll or a survey a very complex issue. Keep in mind, we are interested in construct validity, right? We want our question to be answered in a way that actually reflects the participant's opinion. We don't want to bias our poll towards getting one answer or another. At least scientists don't. We want to avoid ways that yield a type of question, a type of answer. So we need to pay attention to various aspects of these things. There are also things that we can do to avoid people from giving inaccurate answers. Right? It's not just the phrasing of the things that we need of these questions that we need to take into account, but what about the people? Some individuals, including perhaps some of you, may be skeptical that people can give meaningful responses in self-report type situations. But in most cases, people are actually remarkably accurate. Yes, we emphasize that people can be wrong, can be subject to various biases, but overall, people are remarkably accurate. People can accurately report their gender identity, can accurately report how happy they are with their life, can accurately report their income, can accurately report their ethnicity, can accurately report whether they've been victim of a crime, and so on. Right? There is very often there's no reason to think that people may be biased or may give wrong answers. Self-reports can be very, very useful. However, yes, there are ways in which people can be less than accurate. And one of these things is that sometimes people use certain types of shortcuts when answering questions. One of these are known as response sets, and this happens particularly in long questionnaires or long surveys or long polls, right? When you have to fill in a whole bunch of different questions. A response set means that you take a tendency to respond to every single question in the same way, right? So this is independent of question order. It's just that you, while you're filling this in, you go like, oh, that's yes, that's yes, that's yes, that's yes, that's yes. That's called acquiescence. That's a type of response set where people have a greater tendency to answer yes to certain questions. That's overall a finding. Regardless of what the question is, people have a slight bias, or sometimes not so slight bias, to saying yes instead of no. It's a yes-no question. Right? I talked about priming. In this case, respondents are kind of priming themselves. They try to appear consistent to themselves, perhaps, or to the researcher. You get into a response set. You get into a way of answering questions rather than evaluating each question individually and answer to each question individually. You answer them in similar ways. And so, yeah, like I said, one of them is acquiescence. The bias for people to say, in a yes-no question, to say yes. So acquiescence and other types of response sets can once again threaten the construct validity, right? Because then you're not measuring people's actual behavior, you're measuring people's tendency to say yes. So that's another reason why researchers may want to use the same question except phrased negatively, right? I like watching sports. I don't like watching sports, right? Because then you can catch people's tendency to acquiesce to questions. You can see whether or not they're in a response set. Of course, one question doesn't actually, just if they catch that one question doesn't mean they're not in the response set, but at least you can capture them in a certain sense. A better way is to even it out, right? So have as many items where you expect a yes as where you expect a no for someone with a given opinion. Right? So if you have a poll where you expect people of a certain political orientation, for instance, to have a certain response set, then you phrase half of the items where you expect someone who is, let's say liberal, half of the items in such a way that you expect a yes, and the other half of the items in such a way that you expect a liberal would say no, and then intermix them. And the same, of course, goes for conservatives, right? So that's one way of avoiding response sets. Of course, the drawback of that approach is that you would rely a lot on negatively worded questions, which I just told you should be avoided. And the same goes for when you have items that go, instead of a yes no, go from an agree to disagree, right? Where one is agree, the other one is 5 is disagree, or something like that, right? You would do the same thing, right? So you would reverse the question, and and then you just, when you score the items, you just score them differently. So you would reverse the scoring, so it counts a 1 as disagree and a 5 as agree. Right, so for I like sports, 1 is agree, 5 is disagree, and then I don't like sports, you would, when you score them, you would score the opposite. You would count the disagree as a 1 and the agree as a 5. Another type of response set is fence sitting. This is especially for Likert scale type questions, right? Where again, where the scoring goes from 1, let's say 1 to 5, from completely disagree to completely agree. And that's avoiding the extremes. Fence sitting, I don't know, answer something in the middle, right? So instead of saying yes, you answer, I don't know, basically, or yeah, I kind of agree and I kind of disagree to everything. That's another response set. Again, that can weaken the construct validity because it seems like you have someone who doesn't have very strong opinions, even though they may very well have. They're just biasing themselves to answer each thing in a certain way, right, where they avoid the extremes. Right, so in a 1 through 5 Likert scale again, right, they may answer only 2s or 3s or 4s and a particularly high number of 3s, avoiding the 1s and 5s. One way to get around this is to avoid a neutral option. So instead of a 5-point scale where 3 is neutral, you can use a 4-point scale. Completely disagree, somewhat agree, completely agree, right? So that you have less fence sitting. Although once again, you can ask questions about the construct validity, because what if you have individuals who truly don't have an opinion or truly don't feel committed? Right, so they're forced to pick an option that they don't really, that they don't feel represents them. So, as a researcher constructing a set of items and a set of possible responses, you have to carefully weigh which one you want to emphasize. Another one is to just use agree or disagree or yes/no answers, right? Instead of completely agree and somewhat agree, they just have to have an agree and a disagree. But again, the problem there is that we may have actual fence sitters, right? And not just people who are in a response bias. So the option there is to have an I don't know or no opinion as a third one, right? For people who have actually no opinion or don't feel that they're informed enough to say yes or no. That might be valid, but once again, then you don't perhaps capture all of the variance in opinions that there is, right? So then you have an agree, a disagree, and an I don't know, or a yes and a no and an I don't know. But again, then you may not capture all of the different opinions that are out there. So once again, you end up in a position where you have to carefully pick, as a researcher, which type of construct validity you want to emphasize in your poll or survey.